In April of 1841, a scandal erupted in Colleton County that silenced even the most callous planters. Silas Rutledge, owner of Cypress Grove Plantation, announced that his daughter Catherine, an isolated woman of 28, burdened by weight and violent moods, would be placed under the absolute authority of an enslaved man. The arrangement was disguised as a medical experiment, but the truth ran deeper, tied to debts, dark rituals, and a hidden society that thrived in the county's shadows. The choice marked the beginning of a year drenched in fear, transformation, and blood. By November, 13 men would be dead and Cypress Grove reduced to ash. Colleton County sat in the damp low country, where the Combe River slid like a black vein under curtains of Spanish moss. Its rice fields and swamps yielded wealth for a few and misery for hundreds. To the county's elite, cruelty was simply nature's order. Men were strong because others suffered. Silas Rutledge, with his 800 acres and 58 enslaved laborers, hovered at the margins of this power. He wanted the recognition of Charleston's grandees, but remained a desperate aspirant. Catherine had grown up in a lonely house haunted by whispers. Her mother had died at her birth, and her father's obsession with status left little warmth. Doctors called her hysterical, drugged her with mercury and laudanum, and confined her in her room when her screams or violence embarrassed the family. She was known locally as Silas's Shame, a once pretty child transformed into a grotesque recluse. But beneath the fog of medicine and isolation lay something no one understood. Catherine had seen what no 12-year-old should have seen. She had walked into the cellar during one of her father's secret gatherings and witnessed men cutting flesh from a living woman, their goblets raised in ritual. Silas belonged to the Brethren of the Harvest, a circle of 13 prominent men who mixed European blood cults with African spiritual fragments stolen from the enslaved. They believed the land demanded sacrifice, and they fed it with blood, sometimes animal, sometimes human, always vulnerable lives. Silas's obsession with their approval consumed him. He borrowed recklessly to keep pace, lost fortunes gambling, and sank into debt to his own brothers. When the Brethren demanded repayment, they offered him a different path. He could prove loyalty through humiliation by surrendering his daughter to one of his enslaved men for a full year, not in name only but in totality. If he obeyed, his debt would vanish, and his place in the circle would be secure. He accepted. The man chosen was Ezekiel Cross, a towering 33-year-old recently purchased out of Virginia. His back carried no scars, his hands bore the precision of a carpenter, and his eyes never lowered in submission. Unknown to Silas, Ezekiel's arrival was no accident. 3 years earlier, Silas had split Ezekiel's family in an act of casual cruelty, selling his wife Sarah and children Benjamin and Ruth southward to their deaths, simply to demonstrate pitiless resolve to the Brethren. Ezekiel had survived by design, moving from plantation to plantation, learning, listening, and waiting for the moment to strike. Cypress Grove was his chosen ground, and Catherine, broken but not defeated, would become his unexpected ally. Their first meeting was the collision of two wounded souls. Catherine, drugged and trembling, spat hatred at every healer sent to her, but Ezekiel did not act like the others. He did not restrain or scold. He opened her curtains, asked questions, and suggested what she had long suspected, that her sickness was inflicted, not natural. The mercury, the laudanum, the endless treatments were chains, not cures. For the first time in years, someone named the truth she had clung to in secret. Her father was poisoning her mind and body to ensure silence about what she had seen in the cellar. The realization forged a dangerous alliance. Catherine agreed to follow Ezekiel's regimen, enduring the agony of withdrawal as he replaced poisons with herbal tinctures. She sweated, vomited, and raged through nights of torment, but clarity began to return. The tremors eased, her speech steadied, her mind sharpened. With each day, she became less the pitied recluse and more the woman her father feared, intelligent, observant, and capable of remembering every detail of the Brethren's crimes. As her body regained strength, Catherine revealed her hidden journal, pages filled with coded notes of visitors, nights of chanting from beneath the house, and scraps of memory from rituals she had witnessed. Ezekiel, in turn, shared his own grief, the family torn from him at Silas's hand, the knowledge of the Brethren's reach, the names and symbols he had gathered during years of deliberate suffering. Their shared rage fused into purpose. Catherine declared that every man who had stood in the cellar, her father, the judge, the reverend, the banker, must die. Ezekiel did not flinch. For him, justice required nothing less. The transformation shocked Colleton County. At a dinner attended by its most powerful families, Silas announced Catherine's recovery, attributing it to Ezekiel's care. Then, before dozens of astonished witnesses, he proclaimed that his daughter's treatment demanded permanence. Ezekiel would have complete authority over her life. The silence was suffocating. For white society, a daughter placed beneath an enslaved man was an abomination. Yet Catherine, calm and clear-eyed, confirmed she accepted the arrangement. Behind her smile, she clenched her napkin until her knuckles whitened. Whispers of humiliation spread, but Silas had satisfied his brethren. What he did not see was the fury kindling in his daughter's eyes and the quiet calculations turning in Ezekiel's mind. They had accepted their roles in public, but in private they sharpened their conspiracy. Catherine remembered the ledger whispered about by the men, a great book that recorded every ritual, every sacrifice, every name. It was hidden beyond a false wall in the cellar, the heart of the brethren's secrets. If they could seize it, they could destroy the society forever. The date was set, May 14th, when Silas would travel to Charleston. The house would be theirs for 3 nights. Catherine sketched the cellar's layout from memory. Ezekiel planned their descent. Both knew that if they were discovered, death would come swiftly and mercilessly. Yet both also knew that revenge required evidence, and the ledger was the key. The night approached with unbearable slowness. Catherine grew stronger each day, walking the halls, rebuilding her body, while Ezekiel listened, observed, and mapped every rhythm of Cypress Grove. Above ground, life moved on with the illusion of calm. Beneath it, 2 conspirators prepared to step into darkness, and found that darkness waited the truth of what had been. Done for 40 years, truth so monstrous that it would either destroy their enemies or devour them both. On May 14th, Silas Rutledge departed for Charleston, his carriage vanishing down the dirt road at dawn. By nightfall, the plantation had fallen into its usual uneasy silence. Servants extinguished lamps, overseers retired to quarters, and Cypress Grove seemed to slumber. For Catherine and Ezekiel, this was the moment they had waited for. They met in her chamber just after midnight, both dressed in plain, dark clothing that allowed freedom of movement. Catherine's hair was bound tightly, her face leaner now, her eyes burning with clarity. The woman long mocked, as Mad looked instead like someone preparing for war. Ezekiel carried a shuttered lantern, its small flame masked, his heart pounding with the knowledge that this night might end everything, or begin it. The entrance to the cellar lay hidden in the kitchen pantry. To anyone else it was only paneling, but Catherine pressed against one stone until a hidden latch gave way. The door swung inward to reveal stairs plunging into damp darkness. The stench rose immediately, rot, smoke, and something metallic like old blood soaked into wood. Catherine had smelled it since childhood and knew exactly what awaited them below. Step by step they descended into the chamber of the brethren. The room opened into a square vault with low ceilings and walls slick with moisture. At its center stood a wooden altar, its grooves blackened with stains no washing could erase. Black robes hung neatly along one wall, and shelves sagged with jars sealed in wax. The place felt less like a cellar than a tomb. Catherine guided Ezekiel to the far wall, where her memory insisted a hidden chamber waited. She pressed against a loose stone, and the wall shifted with a click. Behind it lay a smaller room, and at its heart stood the object they sought, the ledger. Bound in dark leather, clasped with iron, the massive book radiated menace. It was not rumor, not whispered fear. It was proof. Ezekiel opened it and felt his breath catch. Page after page bore neat handwriting cataloging decades of ritual, names, dates, methods. The sacrifices were not sporadic. They were systematic, tied to planting cycles, harvest seasons, and power. Victims numbered in the dozens. Enslaved men and women, poor wanderers, indigenous captives, reduced to cold entries and macabre recipes for flesh. Then Ezekiel found the entry he had searched for since the night his family was taken. 3 short lines: the purchase of Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth, their separation from him, their transfer to Alabama, their deaths reduced to ink. Rage nearly blinded him. He wanted to rip the book apart, burn the cellar, strangle Silas Rutledge with his bare hands. But Catherine's hand gripped his arm. Evidence meant more than fury. They copied what they could, focusing on the names of current members, the patterns of killings, the existence of the network stretching far beyond Colleton County. For hours they labored in the oppressive dark, scratching notes by dim lantern light. Exhaustion set in, but they pressed on, driven by the certainty that this ledger was the key to destroying the men who had crushed their lives. Then light flared at the cellar door. Ezekiel froze as a brighter lantern spilled down the stairs. Silas Rutledge stepped into the chamber, flanked by two men. Behind them came more shadows in the passage, their faces familiar. The brethren had returned. Catherine's father looked upon the open ledger with quiet triumph. He had never gone to Charleston. He had staged his departure, watched the house, and waited. Catherine's so-called recovery had made him suspicious, and he had planned for this betrayal. They were dragged from the chamber and locked in Silas's study. The ledger was closed and carried away, but Catherine had concealed some of her copied pages against her skin. She whispered to Ezekiel that her father would not kill her outright. Not yet. She was still his daughter, still valuable. That gave them time. But time was a fragile shield. Within the hour, the brethren assembled in the cellar in full ritual garb. 13 chairs formed a circle around the altar, every seat filled by a man of wealth and power. The judge, the reverend, the banker, and Silas himself at their head. Catherine and Ezekiel were forced to stand in the center. The air thickened with candle smoke and chanting. The verdict was debated briefly. Some wanted immediate execution, their bodies consigned to the swamp. But Silas had a crueler idea. He offered Ezekiel a chance to live. If the man who hated them most could be brought into the circle, it would prove their dominion absolute. Ezekiel was told he could join, not as an equal but as an associate. In exchange, the brethren would give him resources to destroy Edward Gaines, the Alabama planter, who had worked his wife and children to death. It was a vile bargain. To accept meant becoming a monster, complicit in every crime. To refuse meant death for him and for Catherine. Silas raised the stakes by promising Catherine's exile. If Ezekiel complied, she would be sent north, given money and a false name, allowed to vanish. It was an illusion of mercy, but it was enough to sway some of the circle. Catherine spat defiance, refusing silence or exile, but Ezekiel, after a tense pause, agreed. He did so not out of surrender, but out of calculation. Acceptance bought time. Catherine saw through the lie and understood. She was taken away the next morning in a carriage that rolled down Cypress Grove's drive at dawn. No farewell was permitted. Ezekiel watched from his cabin window, clinging to the memory of her eyes flashing with unspoken trust. 3 weeks followed, each day stretched on a rack of dread. Ezekiel was kept under constant watch, shadowed by overseers, tested with meaningless labor, and observed for any sign of rebellion. Yet he studied everything, the movements of guards, the rhythms of the house, the habits of the brethren. He understood they would test him in their initiation, force him to commit an atrocity, to bind him in silence. He weighed how far he would go and what lines he could not cross. On the eve of his initiation, Silas visited his cabin. In the quiet night, the master laid out the philosophy of the brethren: power for the strong, ruin for the weak, sentiment as weakness, cruelty as strength. He urged Ezekiel to embrace it, to abandon love and become one of them. He admitted openly that Catherine had not been sent to Philadelphia as promised. She was in hiding, and her survival depended on Ezekiel's success. If he failed the initiation, both would die. Ezekiel listened in silence, rage masked by stillness. When Silas left, he sat alone with the slip of paper that bore his family's names: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. He whispered apologies to the dead and promises to the living. Whatever awaited him tomorrow, he would not bow to monsters. He would play his part, but only long enough to tear their world apart. The night of June 3rd arrived. The cellar blazed with candlelight, every brethren member robed and chanting. Ezekiel was stripped to the waist, his hands bound and dragged before the altar. Upon it lay a young enslaved woman, gagged and terrified. The knife placed in Ezekiel's hand gleamed with reflected firelight. He was commanded to make the first cut, to prove his loyalty, to prove that his hunger for revenge outweighed any trace of mercy. The chanting rose. The woman's eyes locked on his, wide with terror. In them, Ezekiel saw Sarah's defiance, Benjamin's innocence, Ruth's despair. He saw every victim who had ever bled in that chamber. He raised the blade, and then he turned, not toward the girl, but toward the nearest robed man. The knife drove into flesh, and blood sprayed across the altar. Chaos erupted. The cellar exploded into chaos. Ezekiel's blade tore the throat of the first man before any of the robed figures understood what was happening. He wrenched free the dying man's robe and hurled it onto a cluster of candles, plunging half the chamber into sudden darkness. Shouts rang out, chairs crashed, and the careful order of the brethren dissolved into confusion. Ezekiel moved like a storm. Years of anger and grief sharpened into violence. He smashed a candle holder across a face, shattered a kneecap with his boot, and flung one panicked man into two others. These planters, judges, and reverends had grown fat on blood but had never truly fought. Ezekiel had fought all his life, first to survive, then to reach this very night. The young woman on the altar scrambled away as her bonds fell free. Ezekiel roared for her to run, and she fled up the stairs, shrieking into the night. Her cries carried across the plantation, and others heard them, others who had been waiting. Above, Catherine had returned. She had never gone north, never accepted exile. She had spent 3 weeks hidden among the enslaved quarters, whispering to those who had lost sons, daughters, and brothers, to the brethren's cellar. She had carried her journals and her rage from plantation to plantation, gathering 23 men and women who had nothing left to lose. They came with axes, scythes, and hammers. They came with silence, grief, and fury. When the young woman burst from the kitchen screaming, Catherine led the others forward. They surged down into the cellar like a flood. The brethren turned too late. The enslaved people who had lived under their lash now struck back with a savagery born of decades of cruelty. Judge Pelham fell beneath an axe before he could draw his pistol. Reverend Crenshaw begged for mercy and was silenced forever. Marcus Fanning tried to claw his way up the stairs, only to be dragged down and broken. The brethren's power, built on secrecy and blood, crumbled in minutes. They had relied on fear to rule, but fear had turned against them. Silas Rutledge made one final desperate move. He seized Catherine by the hair and pressed a knife to her throat, roaring for the slaughter to stop. The chamber froze, but Catherine did not tremble. She looked into her father's face and told him to do it, to kill her because his victory was already gone. His grip faltered under the force of her defiance. She drove her elbow into his ribs, spun away, and in that instant Ezekiel was there. The two men faced each other in the flickering half-light, master and slave, tormentor and victim. Silas had stolen Ezekiel's family, poisoned his daughter, destroyed lives without hesitation. Now he stood with nothing left but desperation. He whispered pleas for mercy, but Ezekiel saw only the faces of Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth. Mercy had never been offered to them. It would not be offered to Silas. The reckoning was swift and final. One by one, the brethren were cut down until not a single member remained alive. 13 bodies lay scattered on the cellar floor, their robes soaked in blood, their power extinguished forever. Catherine stood trembling amid the carnage, not from fear, but from release. 16 years of silence had erupted into a single night of vengeance. She and Ezekiel looked at one another, two survivors bound not by blood, but by shared rage and loss. When Ezekiel asked what came next, Catherine answered with a grim smile. They would burn it all. The cellar was doused with oil. Bodies were arranged to look like victims of a tragic accident. Every robe, every relic, every jar was piled onto the altar. The ledger itself was set at the center, but Ezekiel tore free the pages naming his family, folding them against his chest so they would never vanish. For the rest, fire would be their burial. Catherine touched the flame to the wood and the cellar erupted. The blaze roared upward, devouring robes, pages, and walls. The two of them fled into the night and stood together in the yard, watching Cypress Grove burn from the foundations. The fire rose high enough to wake neighbors miles away, but by the time help arrived, the plantation was ash and ruin. The story spread exactly as Catherine had planned. 13 prominent men had gathered for a meeting. A lantern had toppled, a fire had broken out, and the masters of Colleton County had perished, trapped below ground. Catherine Rutledge was declared among the dead, her madness a tragic footnote. Ezekiel Cross was said to have been sold to Alabama, his trail conveniently erased. No one looked deeper. No one dared. The enslaved who had risen that night slipped back into silence, scattered to new plantations when Cypress Grove was dissolved. None spoke of what they had done. Survival demanded silence, and silence was the shield that kept them alive. Yet in the quarters, in whispers passed at night, the tale grew. They spoke of the night the masters burned, of the woman who remembered and the man who struck back. With each telling, the truth blurred into legend. Catherine disappeared into the north, carrying her journals coded into nonsense only she could unravel. She swore that someday the story would surface, when the world was ready to hear. Ezekiel vanished westward, into frontier lands where fugitives could carve out hidden lives. Some said he became part of an underground network, helping the enslaved escape. Others believed he simply walked into the wilderness to find peace. His name faded, but the whisper of what he had done never did. Decades passed. The ruins of Cypress Grove were torn down, the land replanted, the memory buried, yet every so often evidence surfaced. A journal walled up in plaster, bones unearthed in a swamp, marks carved into trees. Each discovery hinted at the truth, but never revealed it whole. By the 20th century, only scraps of the legend remained, that cruelty breeds its own destruction, that power built on blood eventually crumbles to ash, that the powerless are never truly powerless forever. What began in darkness in April of 1841 ended in flames before the year was out. Silas Rutledge believed he could preserve his status by sacrificing his daughter. Instead, his own cruelty armed her with fury and gave Ezekiel his chance. Together they proved that even the mightiest can fall, when those they oppressed rise together. And though the brethren of the harvest tried to erase every trace of their existence, one truth endured, passed through whispers and half-remembered stories. Secrets cannot stay buried forever. The ledger turned to ash, but the memory remained.